So, today, we're hearing this reading from Acts. And Acts is the one book of the Bible that really tells a story about the church. Everything, Jesus didn't start a church. Jesus didn't didn't separate his believers. But the people who followed Jesus pretty quickly came to understand that they were a people. They were a group in their own right. They were the church. And Acts is the one place where the story of that church is being told. I see somebody looking at the screen over there, the bread. Well, I'll explain what that's about. Because this Sunday, I also want to talk about Veterans Day. That may not look like it has much to do with Veterans Day either, but it does. I think this is a time when every year Veterans Day makes me think a little bit more, because what they call the greatest generation is passing away. And there's fewer people who went through those experiences of Depression, World War II, fewer of those veterans around. I think this whole thing about the greatest generation, and this comes from being the son of baby boomers, well, almost, a little bit before that. I feel like all the interest in World War II and that time period comes in part from all those people who, when they were in their 20s, when they were younger, they thought their parents didn't know a thing. And now as they've gotten older and been able to understand a little bit more, and maybe are the same age their parents were back when they were young, started to realize that their parents had some things going on, as they might say. That there's some real values there. There are values that got me here. I really wanted to be in a place where it wasn't just a whole bunch of kids. Where I could learn and even help to communicate some of those values that the greatest generation, that the World War II generation, some of whom are here, has. I say had because I'm thinking about Roy Bennett, who passed away a few weeks ago. And the first time I came to his house, some of you have heard this story, but I walked in and he started showing me around the house, and he's showing me his glass collection and pictures of his kids and some of his model planes. And he mentioned he'd been in the Army Air Corps, kind of offhandedly. And I turn around the corner and there's this big display with a whole bunch of medals in it. And some, I knew the World War II medal, the Victory Medal that people received, and there was something that was a bronze star and had like 5 oak leaves on it, which means he got 5 bronze stars, which is kind of a big deal. And I said something to him about it. I said, "Oh yeah, I was in the war, and I went to Normandy, and he was a bomber pilot who had flown 28 missions, even though you actually only had to fly 25 because it was so dangerous that if you survived 25, they let you stop." And he went on and did some extra with the crew that he had at the time and came home and didn't tell people about this. It's amazing to me. I think also about grandparents, and one of the reasons I say had is because that's my grandparents' generation. My grandfathers, one fought in World War II, and one was a factory worker in Detroit, so he was busy building stuff for the soldiers to use, so they kept him home. But they've been gone for almost 20 years now. But Kate's grandparents are still around, who also both served. And her grandfather was a paratrooper. He said he signed up because he got paid an extra $25 a month. That was his story. And he signed up, and he got signed up and learned how to jump out of a plane in Georgia, and then got sent off not to Normandy but to Italy, and came in through the south with a unit called the 517th They call themselves the Battling Buzzards, which I guess it worked for them. And that was kind of the story he said. So he was a paratrooper, and he jumped out of planes, and he was involved in an invasion of France from the south and the invasion of Italy. And he spent some time in Belgium. He didn't tell us for 60 years that the time he spent in Belgium was a little thing called the Battle of the Bulge. He was in the Ardennes. If you saw Band of Brothers, he wasn't in that unit that got tripped, but he was right in there with them. This amazing story. He actually was injured because he got hit in the head by a shell that didn't go off, and was put up for 3 months, and then went back into the battle that was still going on. He just has all these amazing things that he went through, and terrible things. You know, he was a machine gunner. He used a machine gun in combat. He doesn't talk. 60 years went by before he would talk about that. But it's what should have been a really terrible time. So here's the thing. One of the things about Kate's grandpa is that he tinkers. He makes stuff. He has 5 Model Ts, which he rebuilt out of rusted chassis. He has these things called Stirling engines, which are these hot air engines that didn't quite catch on, so he builds them. And he bakes, guess what he bakes? Bread. He bakes bread, and he never uses a recipe. Makes his own bread by hand. Different each time. It's always a little different. He's always tinkering with it. And Kate finally said to him one day, why don't you use a recipe? And he said, well, see, back during the war, when we invaded southern France, my unit got dropped behind enemy lines. And they dropped us in the wrong place. So we were dropped, but our supplies didn't come along with us, and we didn't have any support. So they told us that what we were supposed to do in that situation was to hole up until we could make contact with the larger force. So they're there, you know, there's the American army's coming in, but they're in German Nazi territory, not sure when somebody's going to show and the cavalry's going to come in, really. And they hid in a farmhouse, and for days, they just got bread and wine. And the villagers hid them out and gave them bread and wine. And that's what they ate. And he said, I've never tasted bread like that since. And for 60 years, he's been trying to recapture that bread. But you really think it's the bread? You think there's any recipe, any special flour, salt imported from France, special yeast that could recapture that bread? Now we think that it's the moment of being there with these people, these friends, and these strangers alike, being bonded together, sharing those meals. That's the thing that he can't find again. And what's so amazing about this should have been the worst time of his entire life. Stranded behind enemy lines, hiding out in a barn, knowing that the Germans could come in any time. And yet, he goes back to that. He goes back to that as a time to treasure, as a time to remember. Why is that? Well, it's because of that camaraderie, they say, that togetherness that gets built up. You know, I mentioned this last week, you don't get that kind of spirit of being bound together when everything is going easy. Hard times bring that togetherness out. It's when times are tough that people really start to come together. And the military knows this perfectly well. It's true today, just as it was back then. You know, it's not just true in World War II. It's true in Iraq. It's true in Afghanistan. You know, Jerry mentioned that he and I had talked, and one of the things he mentioned that his son said, and Wesley, who's on our prayer list, is serving out right on the front lines in Kandahar, which is right at the center of the most dangerous fighting. He said, you know, when you're out there, there's not black, white, Christian, atheist, Muslim, any of that. There's a guy on your left and there's a guy on your right. And that's what you count on. In those times when your life depends on the people around you, you just don't spend time squabbling. You stick together. And the military knows this well enough that before you even get into a dangerous situation, they make sure you have some trauma. We all know the stereotype of the screaming drill sergeant. This is a real one. There were some movie drill sergeants. They put you through the experience as a unit so that you're bound together. Because being nice to you and making things easy, it's not just it won't prepare you for danger, it's that you come together. And going through bad times together is part of the process that binds people to each other.